All right, welcome back to the channel. So, Terence Crawford goes in on Canelo Alvarez and says something that pretty much anybody with two eyes can see, which is that he is avoiding black fighters, and specifically Demetrius Andrade and Jermall Charlo. Terence Crawford is 100% right. Critics attack him based on his record. However, he could duck everybody under the sun. It still wouldn't change what Canelo's doing. But let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So Terence Crawford tells the truth, man. He was on Sirius XM and he did an interview. He was asked several questions during this interview, gave some really good answers. I'll do the video on what he said about Errol Spence Jr. later. That was pretty much, repetitive with him saying that, that he's not really pushing for that fight. He talks about the 50-50 split in that fight and all that. We'll get into that in another video. But in this video, he's asked about Canelo Alvarez. And what he says about Canelo Alvarez is absolutely spot on. I'm happy that he said it, and I could not care less if anybody in the boxing media has some argument to say to the contrary, because what he said is 100% accurate. And not only is it accurate about black fighters, it's also becoming accurate about Mexican fighters. Canelo Alvarez is without a doubt avoiding Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, and he has himself said that he no longer wants to fight Mexican fighters. If you look at the fighters that he has lined up to fight, without an exception, they are all white fighters. He's not fighting. There's no black fighters on his to-do list. There's no Mexican fighters on his to-do list. And being a fighter in the United States, a Mexican fighter that fights in the United States at the weight classes of 154, 160, and 168, with the amount of talent that is there, is absolutely ridiculous. And it is nothing other than Canelo Alvarez operating under a different set of rules than other people. And that is something we have seen with Canelo Alvarez for a while now. Ever since he was called the biggest name in boxing and he became somebody that could consistently make money on pay-per-views or draw big audiences. Once he got to that quote-unquote golden boy status, it was over for him fighting guys in his own age group, in his own weight class, who are developmentally near the same level as him. He is completely blowing by all of those guys. But specifically what Terence Crawford says, let's examine what Terence Crawford says. He said that he is shying away from black fighters and that black fighters are the ones that give him trouble. If you look at the career and the style of Canelo Alvarez, it could not be more obvious. He struggles against smaller, quicker fighters. And what he's doing is fighting bigger, slower fighters and taking advantage of a speed advantage that's there. A speed advantage and a skill advantage that is not there with the top competition in his weight classes. Canelo Alvarez, the first time that we saw Canelo Alvarez, this problem was with Floyd Mayweather. You can say what you want to say about how Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, he was more mature. He was clearly one of the greatest fighters that ever did it. And, Canelo just lost in a learning, in a scenario where he was learning. Look, Canelo got blown away by Floyd Mayweather Jr. It was not a close fight. I don't think Canelo Alvarez won a round, okay? And then after that, he went on, I do believe after that, to fight Erislandy Lara, right? And Erislandy Lara beat him, just flat out beat him. I'm sorry, you guys can say what people can say what they want about a close fight, this, that, and the other thing, but my scorecard and many other people had Canelo Alvarez losing to Erislandy Lara. Now, losing to Erislandy Lara is not, there's no shame in that, because Erislandy Lara is one of the best 154-pounders to do it this century, without a doubt. A prime Erislandy Lara is a lot of trouble for Jermell. He's a lot of trouble for Jermall. He's a lot of trouble for anybody at that weight class. He would have been a lot of trouble, I do believe, for Floyd Mayweather Jr. at that weight class. And he was definitely a lot of trouble for Canelo because Canelo flat lost that fight and got a decision, right? You also look at what happened with Canelo and Austin Trout. That was anything but a blowout. There was a knockdown that took place in that fight, but that was the difference in that fight. But after that, you no longer see him fighting agile black fighters. He took one fighter, in Daniel Jacobs, a Daniel Jacobs who had already lost, who had been knocked out by Demetrius Pirog and had lost to Gennady, who had been knocked down and lost to Gennady Golovkin, right? A guy that had been recovering, and I don't know if he ever really got to where he really could be a good, solid fighter, but that's the only example that you have in recent history of Canelo Alvarez fighting a black fighter, right? But if you look specifically at the best fighters in his division that are his age, right? That's Jermall Charlo and Demetrius Andrade. If Jermall Charlo was a champion at 154 the same time Canelo was there. Jermall Charlo was the mandatory to fight Canelo Alvarez, and then they came up with this franchise tag to keep Canelo Alvarez with the WBC belt and not having to fight Jermall Charlo. It is just very, very obvious that Canelo Alvarez doesn't want to fight Charlo, and he doesn't want to fight Demetrius Andrade. Passing up the Demetrius Andrade fight, though, was one that it kind of blew my mind, but I got put on DAZN not wanting the fight. Canelo Alvarez had an opportunity if he would have fought Demetrius Andrade right after he beat Gennady Golovkin and got those 3 belts. Canelo Alvarez had an opportunity to fight for Undisputed, and he passed that up, right, to move up to fight Rocky Fielding at 168. And just look again at the people that he's now fighting and tell me that you see any other top fighter doing this, where you're fighting Rocky Fielding, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, and Caleb Plant. You're telling me that you don't notice the complexion of all of those fighters, right? Like, who does that? Seriously, who does that? You have to look very, very hard at 160 to consistently fight everybody but black fighters and Mexican fighters. You have to be looking for that because he is dang sure finding that, right? Who's he fighting at 168? Or who is he not fighting at 168? David Benavidez. Now, you can say, well, David Benavidez doesn't have a belt right now at 168. The belts are, but still, stop. Canelo Alvarez said a while ago that he wasn't looking to fighting any more Mexican fighters. So on one hand, you have the obvious taking place, right, that everybody can see, that Canelo Alvarez is not fighting these black fighters. He's just not doing it, and he doesn't have any plan on doing it. Again, no plan on fighting Jermall Charlo, and Jermall Charlo's the same size and the same weight. If he moved to 168, Canelo Alvarez ain't fighting him at 168 either. Demetrius Andrade, not fighting Demetrius Andrade, and to boot, he's not even going to fight. Didn't even take the offer to fight Errol Spence Jr. seriously. And Errol Spence Jr. is the biggest fight for him that there is for him in boxing, without a doubt. The only possible fight that Canelo Alvarez could have that would be as big as the Errol Spence Jr. fight is the Canelo Alvarez fight. He's ducking or not taking the biggest fights that are out there for him to be made. There's no question about who the bigger fight is, what the bigger fight is. Is it Caleb Plant or is it Jermall Charlo? Clearly Jermall Charlo. Billy Joe Saunders or Jermall Charlo? Clearly Jermall Charlo. Here's the problem. Canelo Alvarez may lose to Jermall Charlo and he may lose to Demetrius Andrade, and Canelo and his team know that, so they're going to ride out the money. My hope is that will change, though, after the 2 fights that he has remaining on the DAZN card. But my hopes are not held out because I don't really even see anybody in the boxing community other than the usual suspects that are on top of this type of thing. I don't even hear these guys talking and pushing this guy or mentioning this type of stuff. So I like that Terence Crawford said it. And here's my thing. I'm not into fallacies, okay? You pointing out, and this is something, and no disrespect to Mike Coppinger, but when Mike Coppinger made a rebuttal to Terence Crawford and said, it's a big shame, it's crazy for Terence Crawford to be saying this when Canelo's 10th best opponent is better than his first best. First of all, that's not true. No way, not even kind of, right? Canelo Alvarez has 5 or 6 really solid fights, about 5 or 6 really solid fights on his resume. Other than that, you can forget that. He does not have 10 that are better than Felix Diaz. He doesn't have 10 that are better than Ricky Burns. Sorry, he just doesn't, right? He has 5 or 6, 7 really good fights, and hey, he deserves credit for that. But even if Terence Crawford never fought anybody, he completely avoided every top fighter that you wanted to fight. That doesn't make his statement, that doesn't affect his statement and his observation about Canelo. Switching on to what Terence Crawford hasn't done doesn't disprove his point about Canelo Alvarez, and it won't, because his point about Canelo Alvarez is extremely solid. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think, and with that, I'm out. Peace.